Okay, we are live and people are already logging on, and I'll start the countdown clock momentarily. There we go.
Okay.
Yeah.
So who am I in this context? You know, the answer man. I mean, you know, it's like, I've got
basically, would you like to make an opening statement?
You know,
normally we start out with you know, some sort of statement to set the stage before we open up to questions. So I could ask you, for example, how you would define traditionalist metaphysics. That's the title that we.
Oh, traditionalist metaphysics. Well, you know, there are a group of intellectuals and philosophers came together in the 20th century, starting with Renegade and Nanda Kumaraswamy, and including Fritjof Schuon and Titus Burckhardt and Martin Lings and a bunch of other people. And they wrote some very, very interesting books. And what they did is essentially bring together the esoteric teachings that are in the hearts of all the major world religions and to say this is a common tradition. And they posited that as going back to the beginning of the human race, that this knowledge has always been known, has been transmitted one way or another. In our time, it's found in the major religions of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and they did an epitome of this wisdom. And I guess that's what traditionalist metaphysics is. It's you know, metaphysics from you know, as it's defined by those who accept the reality of God or of an absolute principle. So.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm going to ask you to repeat something like that once we officially begin.
Okay.
And I think an interesting question to bring up, since we both have had this relationship with Huston Smith, is how his thinking, or how the thinking of the various traditionalist philosophers might disagree with each other about what should be included in the traditionalist canon.
Well, there's to a degree a disagreement. I mean, the traditionalists like Sayyid Hossein Nasr and Schuon and you know the contemporary. I mean, Nasr is still with us, but you know Schuon passed on. You know, in what 1998, I guess, and I mean, there was some idea that they were accepting Huston because of his prominence, and according to very strict interpretation of traditionalism, there's things that Huston was saying that I don't think, I was surprised that they went along with. You know, like, you know, Whittle Perry would write things against, and others write things against psychedelics. You know.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, or Sayyid Hossein Nasr would saying terrible things, you know, Ram Dass, Richard Alpert, terrible man, you know. But then when Huston comes up with his book on cleansing the doors of perception, they say, oh well, we'll find a place for this now, you know. And Huston himself wondered whether, you know, how whether that was rather disingenuous, you know, because Huston was at that point probably clearly the best known member of the school, insofar as he was a member of the school at that time, which he was, you know. So they sort of had to go along with him. It's like, what's that phrase that, you know, I had to follow them. I was their leader, you know, something like that. And I suppose when, you know, Schuon certainly accepted and incorporated into his manifestation elements of Native American spirituality. Once you do that, you open the whole door to shamanism, and then you, from there, you say, and what's legitimate shamanism? And there's a lot of, tradition of psychedelic use, and the Native American church with peyote and all of this. Where do you draw the line? So the line never got drawn very clearly there. Patrick Laud wrote a book, I forget the title of it, but it was sort of, because he also had an interest in shamanism, so he was sort of positing Fritjof Schuon as in the shamanic tradition up to a point, which I don't think was quite right, Schuon, certainly was accepted by, he was initiated into the Sioux tribe, and I think the other one was the Blackfeet. I may be wrong, but I'm sure about the Sioux. And he had, the Sundance leader, Yellowtail, perform rituals at his compound in Indiana, and had a good connection with some very legitimate medicine people in the Native American world. So, and I think most traditionalists of his generation would go along with that. But then when you get to Carlos Castaneda or something like that, this is another level. So the line wasn't drawn clearly, when it comes to shamanism. So shamanism. So.
Well, ultimately, it seems to me mysticism is about the individual.
Well, it is certainly, if it isn't about if the individual is not included, if you're not talking about, an absolutely personal experience that is authoritative for that individual, then you don't have mysticism. But if you don't have some objective order of reality that you feel you're making contact with, which can be defined in terms of tradition, according to the traditionalists, then you don't have mysticism either. I mean, that's the difficulty with tradition. You've got to, you can't just pour yourself into the mold of tradition. You've got to bring your entire personal experience and personal spiritual destiny, your swadharma. You've got to situate that and find that within a religious tradition. Otherwise, you're setting yourself up for a world of hurt. People can turn a world religion, especially nowadays, a large and ancient world religion, into something no better than a cult, in the sense of, I suppress all I am in order to believe this and act in this way and dress in this way. So there's always the tension between the fullness of tradition and the fullness of your own being and your own experience, and that's the interesting point of struggle and growth that you encounter if you come to tradition in the right way. That's what I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, that seems perfectly valid to me. The only question I would have, of course, when it comes to tradition, like having been raised Jewish, there are a number of different interpretations of what that tradition really is.
Yes, there are. And, the traditionalists under Schuon and the earlier generation, with Guénon, that they went as far as they could in defining what you would call unanimous tradition. And this was very important because they really honed in on the points of commonality of between the various religions and the various schools within the religions. But then they produced an essentialized version of the religion, and which this is what happens to any convert. The convert reads the scriptures and the sages of the religion and says, this is for me, and then joins that religion and finds that they're just a bunch of people who have a bunch of attitudes, ethnic attitudes or whatever, that weren't in those wonderful books by Dionysius the Areopagite or Ibn al-Arabi, or and so, you know, this is what Friedrich Schuon called the human margin. He had to admit that it existed, you know. But so, you know, and of course, in our time, we're now in a period where any overarching paradigm in the world of religion is looked at as a false you know, a framework that's been artificially added on. You know, all that exists is the specific ritual and doctrinal and psychological differences between the vast spectrum of religious believers across all the religions, and there is no commonality, you know. And that's the postmodernist excess. And then, of course, the traditionalists have an excess too of prediction. This is essential Islam. Well, you know, so you have a sense of essential Islam that you get from books, then you go to actual Islam, and you know, you say, wait a minute, what's this? You know, and that's true of anybody who goes to any religion. So.
Well, we're live now. The program has officially begun. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm with Charles Upton, and as you've been listening, we're talking about traditionalist metaphysics today. I'm going to ask you to repeat, Charles, the earlier conversation so that our viewers who have just joined us have a sense of what we mean when we say traditionalist metaphysics.
Yeah, a definition of traditionalist metaphysics. Well, first, the word metaphysics has a number of different meanings now. There is a common meaning, which is just the basic underlying idea of anything, whether it has to do with spirituality or religion or higher non-material dimensions of reality or any of this, which is what you have in traditional metaphysics. It just means, well, the basic metaphysic of this is, in other words, the basic idea that this operates on. Well, the term metaphysics in the traditionalist sense is basically related to, it's related to God, it's related to a sense of absolute reality based upon a sense of absolute reality, and the relationship between God or absolute reality to his, her, or its creation or manifestation. And basically, in search of this kind of metaphysic, some writers in the 20th century, beginning with Renegade and Ananda Kumaraswamy, began to search for the commonalities between all the great world religions and also great philosophical systems like Platonism. You know, are there common principles in all of these religious or philosophical manifestations? And they went very far in that direction and produced some amazing works. And the other names coming after them are Friedrich Schuon and Titus Burckhardt and Martin Lings and Whittle Perry, and the list goes on. Basically, Schuon convened an amazing group of intellectuals, and the most prominent living member of that group is Sayyid Hossein Nasr. And the works they produced, the books they produced about, you know, the commonalities on the metaphysical level between all of the major traditions, and also the sense that the human race has always known these metaphysical truths since the beginning of time or the beginning of humanity. And in our own time, they are expressed as the esoteric cores of the major world religions. So what an amazing literature these people produced. And this, they perfectly articulated the idea of what was called the transcendent unity of religions. Religions are not all equal in terms of their forms, obviously, and they're not, each one is unique in its own way. They can't be made equivalent to one another. But on the highest level, as you get closer and closer to the esoteric or metaphysical doctrines within these religions, which, you know, within Christianity, this would be hesychasm, for example, within Islam, Sufism, within within Judaism, Kabbalah. I mean, when you get to these doctrines, you find that they become more and more similar as they get more and more esoteric and metaphysical, but they never become identical, which is what shows that the unity of the religions is truly transcendent. You don't get a meta doctrine, and then not all traditionalists would agree with what I'm saying here, but you don't get a meta doctrine that is the real doctrine, that all of these are different, dialects of that one language. That one language is beyond words. The unity of the religions is only in the absolute, is only in God. So the differences of the religions are all real and all providential, and yet they all are oriented to the same center, which is truly transcendent. So that's pretty much traditionalist metaphysics.
That was a very good introduction. But let me ask you this, because I know you refer to God quite a bit. And of course, in the monotheistic traditions and also in Hinduism, the notion of God is central. But in Buddhism, it's really, I don't think the notion of God is central or even particularly important. So I wonder how you reconcile that.
Well, yeah, and Renegade had the same problem. I mean, from he accepted the Vedanta, and so he says at one point he was saying, well, from the standpoint of the Vedanta, Buddhism is a heresy, is not true. And then Marco Paulus came along, who wrote a wonderful book called A Buddhist Spectrum, a great book, and he just said, no, this isn't actually right, So they're okay. On one level, there are those who have found, even in the Theravadan scriptures, in the Tripitaka, I guess it's pronounced, references to the self in very Vedantic terms. This didn't become a dominant language in Buddhism, but it was there, and that's one way to look at it. Another way, if you let's jump all the way to the Vajrayana. I mean, really, the Buddha nature or Buddhahood in the Vajrayana is looked at on three levels: the Dharmakaya, the Sambhogakaya, and the Nirmanakaya. The Dharmakaya is the absolute formless truth in itself, beyond form. The Sambhogakaya is the visionary manifestation of that truth in terms of the apparitional Buddhas, and which in a certain sense are, simply modulations of one's own mind. They're taking place in one's own mind. They're not objective out there in space realities. Well, of course, the Christian God is not out there in space either. The kingdom of heaven is within you. But anyway, the apparitional Buddhas, which are not simply, reductionist, in reductionist terms, mere ideas, they are efficacious, to transform, to liberate, And then the Nirmanakaya is, the human, enlightened human being. We hope that in Tibetan Buddhism, your own teacher, your own guru, would truly be Nirmanakaya, the humanly embodied truth of the Dharma. Now, isn't this a bit like the Christian Trinity? The Father is he whom none has seen at any time. That would be the Dharmakaya. The Nirmanakaya, the humanly incarnated truth, is obviously Jesus Christ, and us, insofar as we can become co-heirs with Christ to the kingdom and all of that. And then that would leave the Sambhogakaya or the apparitional, aspect of enlightenment as equivalent to some degree to the Holy Spirit, who appeared to the apostles at Pentecost, and as a rushing mighty wind and cloven tongues of fire appeared above their head. That's pretty apparitional. That's pretty, So in other words, I think the Buddhists nowadays go a little too far in saying, well, we're not theistic. Well, and very often they don't know what God means to someone who has a sophisticated concept of God in one of the Abrahamic religions. They just think, well, we don't believe in some old man with a white beard in the sky. We believe, we're sophisticated. Well, okay, but do you know what the Christians mean by God? Very often the Buddhists do not, So I think that there is more commonality. Now, the Buddhists make a very important point that their doctrines have to be looked at, on the fundamental level as upayas, as things which are efficacious to produce enlightenment and to which is the end of suffering, right? And from their standpoint or in their context, the idea of a personal God does not appear to be that efficacious, and the Buddhists are very afraid, and justly so, of the reification of concepts. They don't like to make metaphysical statements, because you make a metaphysical statement and then suddenly it becomes a thing. You're not describing a reality that's beyond your description. The description itself becomes the reality. And then it becomes what you would say in Muslim terms, an idol, and then this has to be dispensed with, So they worry about the reification of ideas, which is why, officially Buddhism frowns upon metaphysics. On the other hand, the Buddhists have done metaphysics from day one, so they have to do it, skillfully. So the ideas that they're talking about do not become entities in our minds that we fix upon and lose the openness that the Buddhists are trying to cultivate. So.
Very good. Well, we've got a lot of questions coming in from our viewers. I'll start out with a question, and you may know this, that many of the viewers have YouTube names. So, for example, Kev the Rev asks, can we learn metaphysics from words in a textbook or only through personal insight?
Well, that's a real question. If you read deeply enough and you find the texts that are quintessential enough, you may catch a reflection of metaphysical knowledge temporarily. The spirit is temporarily reflected in the turning mirror of the heart. That's interesting. It is not an established realization. It's an intimation of something. So it's worth reading metaphysics, because sometimes you when you're pursuing to the best of your ability and according to God's will for you, your more direct experience of metaphysical or divine realities, you may get very bewildered and what the hell is happening? And they say, oh, wait a minute, I read about that. So in other words, this has some place in the spiritual life. I'm not just off the track. So metaphysical reading is important, but it cannot establish truth in your heart. It can intimate truth, but it can't establish it. Truth is established in your heart by the generosity of God and by your own commitment to spiritual practice. So.
Beautifully put, in my estimation. Marvin Becker would like to know whether you have had mystical experiences yourself.
Oh, I could talk about my old acid trips, I guess. But it's more like a long-term work at thinning the veil of the ego, the veil that comes between the veil, which is my self-concept or my attachment to my self-concept, which comes between my heart and the God it contemplates. So little by little, And of course, I've had meditation experiences. I was meditating at the Abbey of Gethsemane, which is pretty close to where I live here in Lexington, Kentucky, just west of here. And I used to go there before COVID, and every once in a while meditate for a couple of hours with my wife. And I remember once I was meditating, and undoubtedly I got to Nirvikalpa Samadhi because everything disappeared. There was lost time, and I came out and said, well, what was that? And I noticed, oh, I wasn't there. It's very interesting to come out of annihilation and say, oh, I was annihilated back there, wasn't I? Well, in a certain sense, that ruins the whole thing once you say that. But there have been experiences, but experiences to a certain degree, searching for the big experience. It may be valuable for some people. It may lead people exactly where they need to go, but in another sense, it can be a bit misdirecting, because what matters is your faithfulness to your daily practice, and what comes of that in its own time. So,
Manaf Zarail asks, or says to begin with, he says he can never pinpoint a clear consensual definition of Sufism. And then he asks, what are its unique essence / fundamental components that distinguish it from both the rest of Islam and from other mystical traditions?
Well, for the second part of that, what distinguishes it from other mystical traditions is it, and this is the definition of, this is the orthodox definition, or the definition of orthodox Sufism. It's situated within the context of Islam, using Islamic concepts and looking as to figures of the past, as teachers, people who have been Muslims, so Sufism in that rather outward way is generally defined as Islamic mysticism. How that's different from the mysticism of other religions or of other paths is a little harder to answer. Simply that every path is different. Because if they weren't different, there wouldn't be more than one path. So there's a multiplicity, and that is apparently willed by God. Otherwise, he wouldn't have sent more than one religion. So Sufism is certainly very close in form to Eastern Orthodox hesychasm. The use of zikr Allah, remembrance of God, is equivalent to the Jesus prayer, which is also called Mnimi Theou, which means remembrance of God. So, and the relationship, of that, the sense that this is the prayer of the heart, the relationship to the sheikh in Islam, or the starets or Garon in Eastern Orthodoxy. All of those words mean old man. Sheikh is old man, starets is old man in Slavonic, Garon is old man in Greek. Very similar in form. What's the difference? The difference is that every path is unique. And so there's going to be differences. And the need is to find a path or to be found by a path that is congenial to you and that you can give your totality to. And that in essence becomes the path. And if you're doing it right, you're not going to worry too much about comparing it to other paths because you've got some walking to do. I wonder what people are doing walking on their other paths. Fine. I mean, get to a basic degree of tolerance where you're not going to damn anybody just because they're doing something other than you, but then forget about, like Shakespeare said, comparisons are odious. You have a path that you intuit leads from the center of your heart to the center of divinity. And, you got to concentrate on that. And so that's, that's all I want to say about that.
Here's a question from Richard Downs Jr., who would like you to comment on the traditional views of Julius Evela. And as I recall from our first conversation, you said he comes pretty close to being the representative of the fascist branch of the traditionalist movement.
Well, yeah, I mean, he was able to operate under Mussolini. He was not in the fascist party. He was critical of fascism. He was critical of everything, because he had his own idea of what he thought the manifestation of the sacred socio-politically ought to be, which was sacred empire. And he saw that Mussolini wasn't really Caesar or the Pontifex Maximus or whatever, but we have to understand that he had an affinity with the fascists because Mussolini allowed him to operate in fascist Italy. So, and he investigated the Nazis. He met with the SS. They didn't particularly like him. He didn't particularly like them, but he was in that context anyway. So, but I mean, beyond that, Evola is, to me, a semi-traditionalist. He has some his book, Revolt Against the Modern World, is really, it's a wonderful book. You could say it's the companion book to Sir James Fraser's The Golden Bough, about sacred kingship. I mean, it's one of those tour de forces of lore and mythology and history that you can find in Joseph Campbell. It's in that category. So he's done some wonderful work. The Schwannian traditionalists criticize him for saying, what they say is he placed the Kshatriya or warrior initiation higher than the Brahmanic or priestly initiation, which I think is true up to a point, but it is also too simplistic. I mean, he certainly, had a respect for the sacredness of the warrior, but and he, he had the kind of, I would say, Nietzschean distrust of priests and priestcraft, but I think he's worth reading, but to me, he's not a central figure of what I consider to be the traditionalist school in its essence. What he's done is essentially, since his name is associated with Renegade, and a lot of people, probably more people, have heard of Renegade through Julius Evola than they have through Fritjof Schumann. So you get to a point where people will start to look at Renegade as a kind of a right-wing ideologue, which is not true at all. He was very apolitical, and certainly conservative. But, these are people who have only read, apparently, Crisis of the Modern World by Guénon, which gave intellectuals, spiritual intellectuals, a preeminent potential position within Western society to save Western society from its impending doom by, introducing traditional metaphysics. Well, I don't think Western society has been saved, and yet the traditionalist school after Guénon and under Schumann sort of did that insofar as you could, bringing together some very, preeminent intellectuals to do an amazing intellectual work, which anybody will benefit by taking as a course. You don't have to take it as a worldview, as an absolute worldview, but it's a great course to take. So.
Thank you for that. Laura Newbert, who is one of our volunteers, asks, how does one cleanse the jinn influence from UFO experiencers?
Oh. Or from whatever made me vulnerable to the jinn, which probably included psychedelic drugs, misuse of Kundalini yoga without a teacher, whatever. Once the door to the jinn is opened up, it's hard to close it again. You know, that's been the experience of my generation coming out of the spiritual revolution. And, you know, and UFOs are another way to do, you know, to open to that world. Well, okay, this is getting practical. You need to have some kind of prayer life where you're concentrating upon God. And it's difficult to concentrate upon God when the jinn are active, even if they are the so-called good or faithful jinn, the Muslim jinns. Some of the jinn are supposed to be Muslims, you know, the good fairies. The good fairies are better than the bad fairies, but they still are quite distracting, you know. And I consider the UFO aliens to be rather the bad fairies, you know, than the good fairies, generally speaking. You need a spiritual practice that looks beyond the multiplicity of the psychic plane, which is where the jinn operate. Not to say that they're all in your head, but you know that's they have an affinity with that level of existence. You need to see beyond that to the solidity and beauty and truth and depth and stability and generosity and love that is the one. If you can do it, and for that you need a spiritual practice that's oriented in that direction. And beyond that, well, you know, I have problems with the jinn. One of the things I've found, and I don't know if this is just me, but one of the places in the human body that's most open to jinnish influence is the point at the base of the skull. It's called in acupuncture the jade pillow or the jade gate. And sometimes the jinn just, you know, bug me at that point. So I have learned to do my constant remembrance of God, you know, saying La ilaha illallah, there's no God but God. Or there's another one in Islam, which is A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, which means I take refuge in Allah from Satan, the rejected, you know. And whenever, you know, those formulas, you know, I imagine them as I'm saying them, breathing through that part of my base of my skull. Now, I don't know if anybody else in the world has that problem. I don't know if how universal that is, but, you know, it's worth checking out. Do you feel that this is the point where those beings have access to you? If so, you know, and if you have a constant, you know, invocation you can do, invoke through that point. And it temporarily seals the door to that world. Unfortunately, you have to keep doing it. Well, maybe that's why the jinn are there, to make sure you keep doing it. You know, there was always some good in whatever manifestation we encounter. And if you're obsessed by beings like that, this can make you more constant in your prayer life. You know? So.
Okay. Here is a question from a viewer whose YouTube name is Dark Night of the Soul, K-N-I-G-H-T, of the soul, and who asks, what is your take on the concept of synchronicity?
Well, synchronicity, my take is, let's say, from the Quran. It says in the Quran, I will show, Allah is speaking, he says, I will show them my signs on the horizons and in their own souls until they know that this is the truth. Is it not enough for you that I am witness over all things? So he's saying, my signs will appear in the outer world and also in your psyche, in your inner consciousness. And, you know, the principle from which inner consciousness, you know, inner psychological experience and outer world both emanate is Allah. Allah transcends the distinction between subject and object. He's the origin of both. He manifests in terms of the polarity of self and world, of my experience in that world out there. And so in a certain sense, I would say if the veils of the ego were lifted, everything would be synchronous. Every experience, every modulation of your own consciousness, you would see as completely mirrored in a change in the outer world, or vice versa, because Allah is witness over all things, and He's Lord over all things. So I don't think there's anything. It's interesting when a synchronicity that's very striking happens. It shows that temporarily some aspect of your ego, which is your, I define that as your obsessive self-definition. I am this and the world is that. Okay, I am this and the world is that. Well, that's your ego, and some part of that has let loose of its grasp for a moment, and you can see, wait a minute, that there's a continuity between self and world. There isn't this big, barrier. There is, we're all part of the same matrix, and God is, Allah is witness over the whole thing, which means you can see inner self and outer world as a single field, and you're beginning to get to that point when you're having a synchronistic experience. But if our egos were completely dissolved, everything would be synchronous. So.
Okay. Shadow Fire 0001 wants to know what your experience has been with the broader Islamic community here in the United States, and were they accepting of your Sufi stances?
Well, my relationship with a broader Islamic community, because basically I have worshiped with Sufis. I've been to a mosque a few times, but I don't frequent mosques, which does not mean don't frequent mosques. It's just that hasn't been my experience or the way I've been led. So exactly how the non-Sufi Muslims feel about Sufis in North America, I have little personal experience of. I know there's a difficulty where people, particularly from a Wahhabi or a Salafi direction, will look at Sufis as heretics. There's a lot of other Muslims who are more open to a Sufi perspective. There are some people who are sort of nominal Sufis who became initiated. I'm thinking of a man here in town who's very prominent in CAIR, which is the CAIR, which is a Muslim sort of service and defense organization, a little bit like the Anti-Defamation League in Judaism. And he's certainly doing that kind of external work, but he's an initiated Sufi. He didn't follow it up much, but so it's an ambiguous, and I wish I could speak more directly to it. My relationship to the larger Islamic community has been through what I call the Covenants Initiative, which is a whole other story. This is a colleague of mine, Dr. John Andrew Morrow, who is a Native American. Actually, he's Métis, which is in Canada, is actually, which is where he's from, Quebec, is actually almost a legal definition of citizenship of someone who is of mixed Native American and European ancestry and identifies as such. And he was converted to Islam as a teenager, and he's done an amazing job in rediscovering the treaties that the Prophet Muhammad made with the other religious communities of his time, Christians and others, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, and this. And his scholarship is amazing. I mean, and so he's brought forward these treaties, which have sort of been known about in Muslim intellectual circles. They used to be more important because they were the basis of the policy, official policy of the Ottoman Empire toward religious minorities. But when the Ottoman Empire fell, they sort of, became more vague in the historical memory of Islam and Islamic scholarship. But he brought them back into prominence in scholarship and in the consciousness of many Muslims during the era of ISIS, because things had gotten so bad that there had to be some truly traditional Islamic way of doing interfaith relations and accepting the validity of other religions. And that's what these documents prove as being the position of the Prophet Muhammad. So anyway, that's how I it's through that I related to the non-Sufi Muslim community, which is another very specific kind of thing, which doesn't tell you, it doesn't give you a global idea of the relationship between me or Sufism to greater Islam. But and how many of the people that knew me as someone who was involved in that initiative, which sort of became an international peace movement at one point, how many of them knew I was a Sufi? I don't know. I didn't bring it up. No need to bring it up. No need to preach Sufism.
Laura Newbert has a question, it's sort of a change of pace. She asks, which of the beat poets is your favorite and why?
Favorite? Well, my own mentor as a poet was one of the Beat generation, Lew Welch, who some people may know of. He was associated as a friend and actually as a fellow student at Reed College in Oregon with Gary Snyder and Philip Whalen. So I don't know. I mean, I think Lew was unique in many ways, and he needs to be better known. Another one who needs to be better known is Jack Spicer. Jack Spicer, a truly unique poet. But then, I love a lot of those poets. Allen Ginsberg, even. I mean, Ginsberg did some great stuff. Gregory Corso did some great stuff. Gary Snyder, perhaps the preeminent nature poet of the Western world for some time. His relationship to nature was sort of more grounded and more full than that of the English Romantics, who also had some beautiful things to say, but less dramatic, but and informed by a sort of a Buddhist matter-of-fact Zen sobriety. So I don't know who's a favorite. I'll just say let people who have not heard of Lew Welch or let me do this or Jack Spicer, check them out.
And I've got a question here from Jeremy Mettery, who asks if you think God is, quote, moral in human terms.
God lays down the law, but he himself does not have to obey it. God transcends moral categories and moral imperatives. And yet the human form, well, we are a particular form, and there's certain things that if we do, we violate our own form. And there are other things which we do, which will enhance our form and help us more fully actualize it. So in terms of our relationship to God, which is determined by our form as much as the reality of God, yeah, there are certain elements of morality that are intrinsic to the human being. But this is expressed in different ways by different traditions, which have a lot of similarity in their moralities, but aren't not identical. In morality, you have to make a distinction between moral rules and virtues. Like a virtue of courage is considered to be a virtue in every tradition. Yet what constitutes courage is very different in Christianity and in Islam. In Islam, it may be, go on jihad, and in Christianity, it may be, make an act of heroic renunciation, like in the monastic life, which, is also available in Islam, just as, struggling against evils in the outer world is also available in Christianity. So there are differences, but the virtue of courage is intrinsic to both. Virtues like courage, humility, self-respect, compassion. These are intrinsic to what it is to be a human being, and the religions recognize this. And so they have each their own way of talking about morality, but this is simply talking about what a human being really is. But you cannot see what a human being really is unless you see him or her in the sight of God, which means in complete objectivity. That's what the presence of God is. So yeah, there is a definite morality that comes from the human relationship to God, which is determined by the human form. The form of the lion has a different morality, right? We can't act like lions because we're human beings. And yet we do have to understand that God is beyond moral rules. It doesn't mean he's half evil, as sometimes you think Carl Jung might have been hinting at in his book, Answer to Job. God's got a dark side. God is half evil. Well, no, God's good is on a level beyond what can be understood through limited framework of morality. And this is pretty formidable because, we see if we take God as the author of all events, and we see some pretty horrendous events coming down, how do we deal with that without denying the existence of God or denying the ultimate goodness and intrinsic love of God? Well, this is a struggle that anybody who's serious about the spiritual life and believes in God is going to have to encounter. And, the scripture says, all things work together for the good to those who love God. Fine. But boy, what you have to go through to come to that understanding, given the rigors of life. So.
John Alexander, who's also been a guest on New Thinking Aloud, observes that you refer to God as a masculine pronoun, he, and he questions, why are you doing that? It seems to him a bit anachronistic, but maybe you could also elaborate on the role of the feminine in traditionalist metaphysics.
Well, the great Hindu saint of the 20th century, Sri Ramakrishna, certainly worshipped God in the feminine form as Kali. That is entirely traditional in Hindu context. Allah is considered to be without gender. And there are words related to God like Al-Rahman, which is, according to the Quran, it says you can call God either Allah or Al-Rahman, which means the All-Merciful. And this comes from a feminine word meaning womb. So certainly there are ways, every tradition understands that God is beyond gender. But why do we say he? Well, In the West, it's traditional to say he. We see God as the Father above, who begets, creates, and rules, and we see nature, Mother Nature, as the receptive matrix of the creative action of God. And this is a deep understanding. In terms of the world, I mean, there's some saints that have said, if everyone who loves God must become feminine in relation to him, whether they be a man or a woman, because God is profoundly active in a masculine sense. And what we're doing is we don't like to make these distinctions anymore because we are suppressing gender. We suppress gender at our peril. Gender is a profound manifestation that is intrinsic to the human form and carries within it intimations and symbols of deep mysteries within the divine nature. So I would say, and this is not the only way to say it. You can say it in other ways. There's a way you can take the essence of God as Shakti, as feminine power. All right. But I would say one way of saying it is God is masculine in relation to the created universe, but in his deepest essence, he's closer to a feminine reality. This is all very, very mystical and very, esoteric kind of stuff. And it takes a lot of context to understand and a lot of contemplation to understand what these realities may mean, in an effective way. But that's one way to talk about it. And there are other ways to talk about it. But if we simply erase gender and erase distinctions and erase polarity, what we're trying to do is destroy the universe, destroy the world. Polarity is the essence of manifestation. If polarities are dissolved, the world is dissolved. And perhaps that's what we're trying to do, really. There's a great self-destructive passion in the human race now, and we don't want to admit how much we don't want to exist anymore because it scares us, but it's there. And I would say there's a reason for us to exist even in a world like this. Existence is a great gift, and without polarity, there is no existence. That's why human beings have fathers and mothers, as a manifestation of that reality. That's where we come from. So,
I've got a question from someone whose YouTube name is Oswald Spengler, and he hopes that the question is not too controversial, but he wants to know what you think about the accusations concerning Fritjof Schuon's pedophilic activities.
Well, here's where you get sued if you say the wrong thing. But I wouldn't. What I should do, I'm just. There's a FritjofSchuon.com, or you can look up Maud Murray, MaudMurray. She is the last living intrinsic wife of Fritjof Schuon. And I think she has the story better than I do, of that whole situation. Basically, she said her husband, or her intrinsic husband was not a pedophile in any way that we would understand that. And yet, in terms of certain legal definitions, certain events happened that could be construed in that manner. But anyway, she's the one to answer that question. So Maud Murray, look her up. She's got things on YouTube and she's got a website. And if you want to study that complicated mess, she's probably your best source. So, and because she also, she has become very unpopular with the remnant of Schuon's circle. But at the same time, she will also criticize certain people who went too far in criticizing Schuon. So I think she's got the answer to that question.
Very good. Now here's another potentially controversial question from a viewer whose internet, perhaps real name, is Anatole de Maurice, and who would like to know if you have any comments about Satanism and its variants.
Well, traditionally, Satan has been the principle of evil in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. So I wonder why people want to worship this, because this is the principle of destruction. And generally speaking, it does not seem to be very healthy to elevate the principle of destruction to some kind of ideal that one should worship. I mean, it's sort of a deferred suicide. If that's what you really believe, how come you're still walking around? You know what I'm saying? Now, there are people who look at Satan as something other than the principle of evil. Or they say, well, that's just what, the religious bigots believe about Lucifer. He's really a great guy. Or perhaps we would say evil isn't that bad. Think about it. Evil is not that bad. Well, I think Satanism is generally not to be recommended for the reasons I've given. So, but I don't know a lot about, its variations. I do have one story though. Back in the 60s, I was a hippie in the back of a hippie bus driving through San Francisco. And in those days, you didn't see bald people. People didn't shave their heads. This was long hair era, The people who shaved their heads were Zen monks, or somebody would be a cancer patient or something. So, that wasn't the style. So I was driving through, or we were driving through, and I was not stoned on anything at all. And in San Francisco, and I see this little black panel truck, which was, it's like a minivan. It's not like a kind of car, vehicle you would have in those times. And it was driven by a entirely bald, shaved-headed man with a black goatee. And it went in forward, past us and disappeared a few blocks in the distance. And then immediately the same vehicle came from the left, and there he was again. And there's no way that he could have gotten from here to there, So I saw something like a bilocation. And at that point, the only person about town who looked like that was Anton LaVey. There are a lot of people later, adopted that style. So I might have seen him bilocate. So obviously something's going on here, but I don't think it's very healthy, because to worship a being who is considered in the major world religions to be the principle of evil is necessarily to accept certain things which have always been considered evil by those religions and by society as a whole. So this is my feeling about Satanism.
Okay, very good. Here's another question from Manaf Zarai, who says, please elaborate on Ibn Arabi's metaphysics and how representative it is of the Sufi view of reality.
Well, if there's one metaphysician or philosopher who is probably most current in Sufism, it is Ibn al-Arabi. There are others, and many others, but I think most Sufis would consider Ibn Arabi to be very important in the Sufi tradition. If you want to know about Ibn Arabi, I unplugged that, but it's still just a minute. I have to do this.
We'll take a short break while you take care of that.
Yeah, I unplugged my phone, but it rang anyway, which is either a supernatural manifestation or just the way machines get weird these days.
Sure.
But so one of the best, a couple of the best presentations about Ibn Arabi are on this YouTube channel, Let's Talk Religion. Does anybody know about that? It's a great channel. It's done by Philip Holm, and he's got something on Ibn Arabi. He's got something on the transcendent unity of being, which is a doctrine identified with Ibn Arabi. And you want to get an overview of Ibn Arabi. It's amazing how well he did it. It's hard to believe because Ibn Arabi is one of the most complex writers, perhaps the most complex metaphysical writer who's ever lived. But Philip Holm, got to his essence, as far as I'm concerned. So, yeah, so Ibn Arabi is considered to be important. There are even some Sufis who believe that if anyone who can do a complete exegesis of Ibn Arabi's Fusus al-Hikam, the bezels of wisdom, a bezel is like a setting for a jewel, like a ring stone. Anyone who could do a complete exegesis of that, is a Sufi master, which other Sufis don't believe, because this is not primarily a conceptual path, although concepts are important and helpful, but certainly it's not essentially a conceptual path. But yeah, Ibn Arabi is valued very highly among most Sufis.
There's a follow-up question here from Anaf Zarai, who wants to know if Ibn Arabi's metaphysics resonates with the philosophy of idealism, postulating one mind as the only true existence, and is that God?
I think it resonates pretty well, and to speak of the one mind is one way of speaking about God. That certainly could refer to nothing or no one else. Whether that's the most effective or helpful way to speak about him in a given context, given that idealism is a philosophy and it doesn't have the fullness of a religious doctrine, morality, and spiritual practice intrinsically connected with it, well, that's a question. But there's nothing wrong with calling God the universal mind, as long as you say, and that's only one way of talking about him, and the ways of talking about him, multiply as one attempts to contemplate his essence. The best ways of talking about him, though, are those which he himself has provided us with. And the question is, has he provided us with that definition of himself? Perhaps, through some great philosophers. But it's always good to, if we need a definition of God, which we do, as long as we don't get attached to it and turn it into an idol, we need some definition of God. The ones that are associated with a stable morality and an articulate spiritual practice are probably the best, because they're not just ideas. There's something, you can do something about these ideas. You can actualize them. So.
Okay, I should let our viewers know we're getting very close to the top of the hour, and we'll be continuing for about another 30 minutes till we get to the bottom. of the hour. And I have a question here from Destiny Glenn, who asks, do you believe there are helpful spirit guides who take an active role in helping people?
Well, yeah. I mean, in the Abrahamic religions, or at least Christianity and Islam, they're called guardian angels. And yes, and the question is, how does one contact these guides, and how does one discern, whether one is being guided by a reliable source, or simply a thought in one's head, or simply another spiritual being who may have some interesting things to say, but is not primarily supposed to be guiding you, or a being who is subtly leading you astray. I mean, it's a very complex thing about who you're, from what spiritual source you should accept guidance. But certainly there are those who are in New Age or whatever circles are called spirit guides, the spiritualist circles, and in Christian and Islamic terms, guardian angels. The question about how to find you have to put God first. If you could put God first, he will send whatever guidance is necessary through whatever forms he chooses. And one of those forms traditionally has been the guardian angel. Whereas if you're seeking the angel and saying, I'd rather find the angel or find the guide, but God, I don't know about God, he's a little bit much, then you're a bit more likely to be led astray. That's all I would say.
Here's a question from someone whose internet name is 80s Warrior, and who says hello and asks, isn't the truth only what you believe, and the limitless of the conciseness?
Well, I wish I knew what that last phrase meant.
Yeah.
The truth is only what you believe? No, the truth is what is true. If you believe what is true, your belief is true. If you believe what is false, your belief is false. Your belief is it certainly determines your experience to a large degree, but it doesn't determine reality. It either conforms with reality or departs from it. Now, the thing is, reality is limitless. So there's a hadith in Islam which Allah says, I am as my worshiper sees me. Now, what is that? That seems to be saying, well, your belief, your truth is the reality of God. Well, yeah, but not just in the context of your own subjectivity, because God is infinite. Whatever you see is going to have an objective reflection or an objective source in God, because he is infinite and absolute. So you have a conception of God, and God will fill that conception with reality. The problem is, this is like in Islam, you have the 99 names of God. And each one of these names of God is a name of God himself. It's not a separate reality. These are different aspects or different names that can be applied to God. But some of the names are large, like Al-Haq is the truth, or Al-Rahman is the all-merciful, or Allah is, God himself, and or Al-Qudus, the holy. But there are other names which are smaller, like, the postponer, or the advancer, or the requiter, or the punisher. They're very small names. They don't say much about what God is. So if you have a smaller conception of God, you will relate to him through one of his lower names, and then you will have a more limited and probably more negative experience. Whereas if you relate to him through a name like the truth, then the field is open. But it doesn't mean that it's just your own truth that you have imagined in your own mind as reality. No, you've opened to a greater truth through a greater name of God. And, you know, if God weren't really there within us and without us on the horizons and in our own souls, then all of our ideas would simply be delusions, self-referential delusions with no nothing to ground them, and we would be in real trouble. So objective truth is a very important thing to believe in. It just means it's not simple. You know, objective truth is not, you know, a box or a petrified idea which is never going to change. Objective truth is limitless, and you can go more and more and more deeply into it. But it has to really be out there, or your consciousness will have nothing to orient itself toward, and you will be in chaos. So
I have a question from a viewer. I want to make sure I get the name correctly because I think I've lost it. And oh, here we go. William Tell asks about the architectural knowledge of the Freemasons. Do you think it is being used to manifest? I'm not quite sure what William Tell means by that question, but where does Freemasonry fit into traditionalist metaphysics, if at all?
Well, that's a big study in itself. So Renegade, who is considered to be the founder of traditionalism, you know, he explored all of the occultisms of his time, you know, including the theosophists and the neo-Gnostics and the Martinists, and you know, he was very serious about looking for initiation in these groups, and he finally came out of them and said, this stuff is really is not just wrong, it's dangerous. But at the same time, he was studying the esotericism of the Vedanta and to a degree of Christianity through Dante and to a degree of Islam, and he came to the conclusion that the esoteric cores of the great world religions were a cut or several cuts above what the occultists and the spiritualists and the theosophists had come up with. So, but the one you would say heterodox tradition or group that he never renounced until perhaps the very end of his life was Freemasonry. He thought that Christianity had lost its esoteric dimension. It may have lost its esoteric understanding of its own tradition, but he thought it lost its esoteric dimension itself. So he said, well, we need to reestablish this. And the way we would reestablish this is through Freemasonry, which is a little, could be within Christianity, a little bit like Sufism within Islam. Well, yes and no. So and he labored amazingly at this. He would write articles for anti-Masonic publications and pro-Masonic publications because he was trying to purify and understand what Freemasonry is all about. He was very right in seeing that there is traditional symbolism and traditional lore within Freemasonry, certainly. So, but what he didn't admit or see is this, you know, completely anti-clerical and you know, in a certain sense, anti-religious tendency within Freemasonry. Although they would not cop to that, they would basically say we believe in all the religions. But boy, did they ever want to destroy the Christian world? So I think that his support or belief in Freemasonry was his major error. Now, and this is because my sense of what Freemasonry is, well, one of the big studies in Freemasonry is who the hell are we and where did we come from, you know? this is not fully understood by the Freemasons themselves. So my feeling is this, and there's, the Freemasons are always associated, rightly or wrongly, with the Knights Templar. So what I think happened is this: the Knights Templar in the Crusades occupied the Temple Mount in Jerusalem and made that their headquarters. And there you had Al-Aqsa Masjid and the Dome of the Rock, preeminent sacred spot within Islam, actually the third most sacred spot, the first being Mecca, the second Medina, and the third Jerusalem. And so there they were, and they had to do some repairs on these buildings. They were using the Al-Aqsa Masjid as a stable at one point, but they had to do some repairs. And so who are they going to go to for the repairs? There must have been a sacred guild that was tasked with maintaining this profoundly sacred site within Islam. And some writers, including Idris Shah, who's sort of a semi-Sufi, he's one of those who wrongly believes that Sufism can really exist outside of Islam, but he has interesting things to say. And he said, well, the basis of the Freemasons was something like a Sufi order or sacred guild called the Builders. And the Builders were founded by the famous and great Egyptian Sufi Dhul Nun, who has supposedly introduced certain elements of Egyptian lore into Sufism. Exactly how he did that, we don't know what that means. But so if they were going to repair these buildings, they must have been looking around for the people who were already working on them, and probably some of these builders came forward and said, well, we're the ones who've maintained these buildings. And they could well have wowed the Templars with some esoteric lore, now that they were at the great sacred city of Jerusalem, and could have blown their minds and saying, well, and of course we accept Jesus as a prophet, and we believe in the virgin birth and all of these things, and this could have been amazing to the Templars, because they just thought, Templars generally thought that Muslims, the Christians at that time generally thought that Muslims were either some pagan sect or they were a Jewish heresy. But, they could have been amazed at the great respect that Muslims had for Jesus and the Virgin Mary, and said, well, maybe these are sort of lost brothers, now that we're in the sacred city of Jerusalem, we found these people, who knows? But what happened is the Templars moved, would keep going back to Europe, and they brought some craftsmen who were working on those sacred buildings with them when they went to Europe. And what went with these craftsmen were architectural styles. They started building octagonal churches, which are like the Dome of the Rock. The first appearance of the pointed arch in Islam was at the Al-Aqsa Masjid. And this could have been the origin of the Gothic arch in the West. So, but if this happened, what you might have had is something like a Sufi order that says, well, we can, we have our own doctrine, so we don't have to stay within Islam. We can move and be part of Christianity, which can be true up to a point. But then, there was finally a basic incompatibility, because something like, the Builders grew up within Islam and was intrinsically Islamic. So it had elements of similarity to Christian doctrine in places where its knowledge could be compatible with Christianity, but there's always going to be a place where this is a fish out of water. And this, I think, was an early example of the wrong kind of ecumenism, or the wrong kind of syncretism, where you have doctrines which are essentially incompatible that you try to fuse, and it didn't work entirely. And out of this finally came what became the anti-clerical or anti-Christian tendencies within Freemasonry. That's my theory.
Okay.
But Freemasonry definitely has a lot of very traditional and interesting symbols, which can be studied profitably, but it has got that problem, you know.
Jeremy Mettery has another question. It has to do with your view of consciousness. Does it survive death? And to expand on that a little bit, let me ask you, what is the traditionalist conception of the afterlife?
Certainly it survives death. The sense of the afterlife, if you're going to look at traditionalism, you know, there's a great spread in the eschatology, the eschatological dimension. Fritjof Schumann, I wish I remember which book he has one on where he does an overview of the different views of the afterlife and how they relate. And he was basically saying these are different possible destinies, you know, reincarnating. Well, the traditionalists don't like the idea of literal reincarnation very much, but the idea of wandering in samsara, you know, is one possible destiny. The idea of reaching a paradise or a hell is another conception. So what you have to do is look at the answer to that question, look at the eschatologies of the different religions. And that's where you get, you know, insofar as the traditionalists have a view of the afterlife, it would include, in a way that's not easy to put together in a single conception, these various traditional views of what the afterlife would be. So, but certainly consciousness survives death. Otherwise, you know, people would not come back from the other world and tell us things. So.
Okay. Got so many different questions to choose from. Here, Real Cygnus asks, what actually exists beneath or above? Ontology is the Q, and I don't think he means QAnon. I think he means ontology is the question. How do you determine what is real?
Well, traditional ontologies are generally hierarchical. At the apex of the hierarchy, you have the absolute. The absolute is also infinite. And it's one, and it's perfect, and it's another name for God. Then on the next lower rung, you have something like the Logos. In Hindu terms, the highest rung would be Nirguna Brahman, which is God, or the absolute without attributes. And then the next lower rung is Saguna Brahman, which is Brahman with attributes. This would correspond in terms of Sufism and Islam to the names of God, the realm of the names of God. And this is also in terms of the creative impulse coming from the absolute to manifest itself on every possible level in every possible way. This is the place of the Logos. This is the place where what is beyond form is generating forms and creating worlds. Yeah. And then the next lower level is the celestial or angelic world, which has many levels in itself. The next lower level is the psychic world, which is vast in its multiple forms. This is the world of the jinn, the fairies, what the Greeks call the daimones, and an awful lot of the spooks that we see nowadays coming out of Skinwalker Ranch and other places, you know, relate to the psychic plane, you know. The next lower level, which could be called part of the psychic plane, is what some have called the etheric plane, which is the subtle material dimension, or the energy level of material reality. And then finally, you get to material reality itself, which is what we see through our five senses. So this is an ontological hierarchy, starting with the absolute and coming out into manifestation of the material world. So that's pretty much the ontology. And we have to also say, though, that God does not just exist at the top of the ontological hierarchy. God is intrinsic to every level and is hidden or revealed, hidden and revealed by every level.
Your answers are very clear, and I really appreciate your ability to take complex questions and address them in such a meaningful and understandable way. John Hernandez asks, do geometric alignments of the human body through methods such as yoga or Kundalini play a role in the manifestation of certain entities or UFOs? And if so, why?
Well, you open those different chakras. Each one of the chakras has a different, it's essentially an eye looking at a different world. And I'm not going to simply say, which of the 7 chakras is the UFO chakra. I don't think you can talk about it that way. But it is certainly true that as the Kundalini rises, subtler and subtler planes of being become available to consciousness. And if the Kundalini is not correctly directed to the Sahasrara, because what finally happens, some systems of Kundalini yoga say once the Kundalini reaches the crown chakra, the Sahasrara, and everything dissolves in a blast of white light, well, that's the final stage. Well, I don't believe that. The final stage is after that, the Amrita overflows from that chakra, and it opens the heart on a deeper level. The heart chakra is open on a level deeper than you encountered on the way up, and it becomes the Hridayam, or the cave of the heart. And this is the point of divinity, of the consciousness of divinity within the human form. So that's what's supposed to happen. But when you get too much, of the activity of various entities, which are essentially at the best going to be distracting from the one-pointedness of consciousness that is required to realize God within the heart, this indicates that a problem has arisen. Kundalini yoga, particularly in times like these, when our whole energy environment is so chaotic, God knows what all the electromagnetic energy and radioactivity and whatever we have released is doing to that environment, and whether Kundalini yoga actually works like it did in a different world age, or earlier in this world age when things were so chaotic on the subtle plane, is open to question. But if you end up, you can inadvertently tear a certain natural protection. One of the ones I know about is the barrier between Ajna chakra, the third eye, and the Shuddha chakra, the throat chakra. The barrier can be torn between these two levels, so they bleed together. And actually, this may be one of the things that psychedelics can do. I remember Richard Alpert Ram Dass was told by his yoga teachers, he says, well, you have a blockage at the throat chakra due to your use of psychedelics. And I said, well, what was that? Because I felt that myself, And one of my speculations about this is you have higher contemplative consciousness that sort of falls and over-energizes mental consciousness. And so, as we know, Richard Alpert never stopped talking until he had his stroke, in which he could hardly talk at all, which almost was a sign, I felt, that, you're so good at articulating spiritual reality, but, are you going to get stuck on that level? So that's one of the things that Kundalini yoga can do if you don't watch out. Something like this. This is why it needs real guidance on every step at the level, because there are technical things about it which you don't know, and only someone who's really an adept of that path can help you through. Which I foolishly did not avail myself of, because Yogi Bhajan appeared to the hippies to teach Kundalini yoga, and he says, "Hippies, try breath of fire, you'll get stoned without drugs," and we did, but man, the consequences were horrendous in some cases. So yeah, it's possible that one thing or another, including Kundalini yoga, can thin the natural. Well, it's talking about there's something called the etheric wall, or as Renegade calls the Great Wall, between physical and subtle realities, and this wall can get cracked. And he says this is what's happening across the board now, late in the cycle of manifestation. The wall between physical reality and subtle reality is developing cracks. One of the big cracks being, let us say, Skinwalker Ranch, where every spook under the sun is flooding into our world, and this can happen in the human microcosm. The barrier between the subtle world and the physical world cracks, and so the subtle material flows into the physical and disorients it. And so, yeah, when you're in a situation like that, you're more likely to get spooks, and you're more likely to see UFOs. And I think our whole society is getting to be a bit more like that. So, which is one of the struggles in the spirituality of the latter days. We have to figure out how to deal with this. Now that we've opened the door and we can't close it again, how are we going to deal with it?
Okay, we have 4 minutes left in our scheduled time, Charles. So I'd just like to give you an opportunity to make a closing statement to kind of tie up loose ends or wrap things up, or let our viewers know what is exciting you the most at this point.
Well, yeah, I'd like to point people to my books, because that's one of the reasons I'm doing this, is to sell books. That's all. That's what I get out of it for my material life. And I've recently published a book called The Alien Disclosure Deception, the Metaphysics of Social Engineering, which is about the UFO phenomenon and the various human groups who are trying to profit by it in a very nefarious way, as far as I'm concerned. If you're interested in metaphysics itself, probably my book Knowings. There's a book called Knowings, a book called Findings, and a book called The System of Antichrist. There's a lot of primary metaphysics in those. So if you like what I'm saying, check out what I said in a little more considered way at greater length in my books. So having made that ad, we'll go on to say what would I say at a time like this? Well, I don't know. It's something I wrote. Do I get to read a little short thing I wrote?
Sure.
Summing up? Okay.
Oh, I think your poetry is fabulous.
Well, and this is, let's see if I can get to my actual, let's see here. The way my desktop is now. It's hard to get back to my desktop. I'm not going to take too long here. If I can't figure it out, I'll just give up.
Okay.
Okay.
If we were more organized, we would have had it all keyed up and ready to
Yeah,
go.
well, I wasn't sure that I was gonna. Well, no, it's gonna be too hard to find. So what I will paraphrase it and see if I can do it that way. Basically, we're in a time of unparalleled darkness on this planet. Everywhere we look, whether we look at disease or war or the economy or the natural world, that the environmental situation, everywhere we look, or social forms, there is darkness. And okay, what is the ultimate meaning of this? What if it seems like there is no way anymore, no way to live a human life in this inhuman world? So, if all things are dark, then if it's possible to recognize the divine light in the heart of this darkness, we have done something unparalleled that could never be done in greater and earlier ages and golden ages of the cycle. We're doing something that we can only do now, which is, and even with all this darkness and everything apparently barreling toward apocalypse, if we can turn and see the light of God in the center of that, we will have accomplished a spiritual work that is unparalleled for the entire cycle. There's something that the Ramayana says, which is supposedly the oldest poem of the human race, oldest poem we have. And I won't remember it too well. I think I, may have quoted it at another interview with Jeffrey. But so the sage who writes this is Vyasa, and he says, in the first age of the world, man crossed the ocean of existence by the spirit alone. In the second age, ritual and worship began, and by following these, men lived well their ways. Now in the last age, we've come to the place where all action is useless, because what we have is we've moved from the spiritual to the passionate. Now we're entering the realm of ignorance and universal war. And he said, the future will read this. He's talking about what's going to happen in the future. The future will read this. Therefore, I tell them, listen, the last age of the world will be best, because in the last age of the world, everything we do is useless except to say the name of God. Here comes my cat. Hello, Pearl. Go behind the monitor. Good. Except to say the name of Rama, which in Sufism, we use the name Allah. La ilaha illallah, we say. That's the only thing that is worth anything. And he says, in the last age of the world will be best, because, we will be reduced to God. It's like William Butler Yeats says, one of his poems, now I may wither into the truth. He's talking about old age. Now I may wither into the truth. So we're reduced to the one alternative, which is turning our entire being and our entire heart to the divine light of God. And the way to do that, as most authorities will say, is through the divine name of whatever tradition you have found, the name of God. And so that's the reason for darkness, is to be able to see God in darkness. The reason for the universal hatred and that seems to be invading the world is to love and find love, even in the face of this. And if we do this, something is happening that is indescribable and is greater than has ever happened before to the human race. And that's how we take the sting out of this terribly dark time. And take it from me, it is not easy. So the other thing is, Renegade said that, well, in the latter days, the Great Wall between the subtle world and the physical world will solidify. This is where you get, this is the age of materialism, the age of miracles is past. It's all material facts, and it seems like humanity is cut off from grace. But we can't be cut off from grace because it is by grace we exist. So he says, what happens then is that wall becomes so brittle, it starts to crack. And it first cracks in the lower direction, which means it lets in floods of infrapsychic forces, like are coming through Skinwalker Ranch, right? All the spooks in the world are coming into our consciousness, into our world. But he said the next thing that would happen, though, is there'll be cracks in the upward direction. And I simply say, let's watch and listen for those cracks in the upper dimension. At the top of the human psychophysical system, the crown of the skull, there's something called the aperture of Brahma, which is where the fontanelles are in the skull. And this can become effectively open for us. The Hopis say, keep the eye in the top of your head open, right? And this eye looks up into the angelic worlds. So if this speaks to you, and if you've had experiences like this already, remember that now the world is at the beginning of a great influx of angelic energy, greater than before, in order to deal with the darkness. We can't deal with it ourselves. It's too big for us. But there are angelic forces coming in which will help us deal with it. And we may wish to intuit those forces. Or maybe not. Maybe that's not part of your path. This is not a prescription. It's just a suggestion that some people may resonate with. So, but the essence is the remembrance of God, and the greater the barriers to the remembrance of God, the barriers of fear and of depression and of hopelessness. Take those as a challenge. That's the darkness. You have to ask, where is this darkness coming from? It's a shadow. It's a shadow of a light. You can't see darkness unless there's light. It's a shadow. What is the light that's casting the shadow, and what is the opaque object that is interrupting the light and casting the shadow? Well, the light is God. The opaque object is the collective human ego, which will manifest at one point as Antichrist. And that's what the shadow is. But if in the center of that shadow, you can look past the opaque object and through it and see the light, the face of the light, you have done the work that we're here to do. And it's possible, but it takes great effort, but not just effort, it takes grace. It takes understanding that God wants this and will help you. And how are you going to turn to God and secure that help? I can't help you. I can't say everybody join the Sufis because my particular Sufi group has got its own problems. If Fritjof Schuen's group had problems, ours has got problems too. So I can't just say, come to us and we will take you in. But there are opportunities. Look for them. You look for the people, whoever they are, whether they're in formal religions or not, who will help you remember God and who put God first. And God willing, we will be able to see the light in this darkness. And then that will be a wonderful work, such as could never be done in what we call the higher and better ages of the world. So.
Okay. Beautifully put, Charles, and I want to thank you so much for being with me today, and thank our viewers for being with us. Of course, the live stream, if you've tuned in late, the archive video will show up soon on YouTube. So I'm going to end